Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be known as sons of God. That's what the good book says. But if that's the standard for what makes someone a son of God, there don't seem to be very many in either Brussels or Washington, D.C., because the majority of the folks there that are in power seem to be working on fighting against peace. Yeah, you heard that right. If you look at the evidence that's before us, and we're about to, there is more effort being put to keep anybody from talking about a negotiated settlement, to keep anybody from ending the war between Russia and Ukraine than there is on trying to bring about a settlement. There's a lot of effort being put into something that can't even be done. I say this a lot now. It bears repeating here at the outset because that's going to form as an underpinning for where we're going with this episode. There is no military path to victory for Ukraine. I don't care how many F-16s, I don't care how many tanks we give, how much dollars we throw at the problem, artillery shells, none of that stuff is going to matter. There's very practical military reasons why none of those things are going to change the outcome, primarily because it's a manpower issue, not just all the stuff that goes along with it, and that will never turn back again in Ukraine's favor. So that's your baseline understanding here. There's no military path to victory success. Therefore, the rational, logical next step would be, okay, let's seek a negotiated settlement. Now, in the news today, the Wall Street Journal had a piece up that said, revealed that there was actually from 2022, which we've talked about several times here, there was a deal on the table that Putin actually mentioned in his interview with Tucker Carlson a few weeks back, where he said in Istanbul, we had the basis of an agreement. You remember Putin famously said, yeah, we had it. It was initial. Their guy initialed it. Well, now then, apparently the Wall Street Journal has gotten copies of it and to validate that, in fact, there was a deal on the table. Now, what they're talking about is that, and the gist of the thrust of that article is that the terms were, quote, punishing. They were really bad for Ukraine, according to those authors. And primarily they do indeed are bad. It included a limit on the number of troops that they could have, a limit on the types of armaments they could have. Not only did they have to be neutral, but they also could not have any bilateral military alliances as well, or get Western weapons. So the terms were pretty harsh to be true. But apparently that was the initial position that both sides were willing to at least discuss. One point needs to be made there, both with this and some other negotiations we're going to discuss subsequently in this episode here. Whatever one side brings to the table, that's the start point. Nobody expects the other side to just sign off on it and initial it unless it's a surrender, an unconditional surrender terms like what we gave to the Japanese at the end of World War II. Otherwise, that's just your entry position. You expect to give and take, and you always ask for more than you think you're going to get so that you can negotiate back to whatever your actual red line is. That's how negotiations work. So when you see these really harsh terms, just understand that anything is negotiable, and those things, if the right incentives are provided on the other side, could absolutely have formed a way to end that war. But the bottom line is that Russia had motivation and desire to end the war before it even had gotten barely started in March of 2022. But as you're going to see, they actually had some ideas for peace that would have been much better in the month or so prior to that war. More on that in just a second. Now, I published a piece earlier in this war where I said, look, this is not an issue that started on February 24th of 2022. This thing goes back 15 years. In the publication 1945, I published an article that said that this was 15 years in the making, and it goes all the way back to the 2007 Munich Security Agreement, and then into the next year's NATO summit in Bucharest, not in Bucharest, the 2008 NATO summit, where Ukraine was first formally declared that they were going to join NATO, that NATO declared they were going to bring both Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance. That's where this goes back to. So when you hear that Putin is evil and that all he wants to do is conquer territory, and then you hear so many people in the West dismiss this idea that actually it's not about NATO expansion. It's never been about NATO expansion. I used to roll my eyes and just laugh at that kind of stuff. But then now that it's no more, it's more like anger, because Putin has been very clear from the beginning of saying, you go down this path, it's going to lead somewhere bad. If you'll just declare neutrality, nobody has to die. There won't be a war because he wants security on his border. He has been outspoken, very clear, and very consistent all the way through. Now, as I say, people can say whatever they wanted to say, but it matters what the actions are. But the words do matter if they show a path and they're lined up with other actions that you can see and other fundamentals. And Putin has been very clear that he doesn't want a war. He doesn't want to go down that path, but he's willing to if his security is challenged. That's going to be critical toward the end of this to understand that what Putin has said, he has followed through. And when he has made warnings, he has subsequently acted on them when red lines were crossed. That's a place we don't want to go in his current red lines. More on that in a minute. But first of all, let's take a look at what he actually said in context with this current situation here. So first of all, we're going to go back to 2007 in the Munich Security Conference, which was at that time not long after the end of the Cold War, and people were trying to say, hey, maybe in the West we should bring Russia into Europe and have a security that benefits everybody and lowers the chance for any kind of war, so we don't have another Cold War. But there were those who were like saying, yeah, I kind of like it where we're the top and they're not on the list at all. And though that started to be a conflict. And so Putin, being invited in there, had this to say.
В Болгарии и Румынии появляются так называемые легкие американские передовые базы по 5000 штыков в каждой. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. А мы, строго выполняя договор, никак не реагируем на эти действия. Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса или к обеспечению безопасности в Европе. Наоборот, это серьезно провоцирующий фактор, снижающий уровень взаимного доверия. И у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение.
So he's laying out there clearly. He said, you call us friends on the one hand, and you want to work together with us cooperatively, but then you're expanding NATO, and we have to ask, who is this against? If it's not against us, then who is it? Because this undercuts trust. And he said very clearly that he views it as a threat and a provocation against Russia. Now, that's where they were trying to talk good. Well, the next year, in the Bucharest summit, the NATO summit, where they finally formally declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. They absolutely said it will happen. It's just a matter of timing that was going to go into it. And Putin made very clear his response to that is that he did, in fact, view that as a provocation. And just months later, toward the end of 2008, he had a limited military incursion into Georgia. And he helped 2 Russian-speaking provinces. Does that sound familiar? And left troops there.
В Болгарии и Румынии появляются.
He didn't go in any further. He didn't conquer all of Georgia. He just moved some troops in there that would then prevent them from ever joining NATO, because now then NATO says that to join the alliance, there has to be no internal disputes and no border disputes with anybody. So now then that violated that problem right there. So Georgia was effectively taken off the table. So he wanted to continue to show that Ukraine needs to be taken off the table too, and everything's going to be okay. That's going to be fine. So that seemed to be going okay for a while, because people kept saying this in the NATO, yeah, Ukraine's going to come in someday. And then every year it was the same kind of thing, and no one moved any closer to it. Well, then, of course, we have the big Maidan affair, which we've talked about recently, starting in December of 2013, when the legally elected government of Ukraine was being protested against, and it was eventually overthrown for a pro-Western group, because the guy that was legally elected was more allied towards Russia and towards Putin. He viewed him as an ally. We didn't like that. A lot of other people didn't. So they, instead of just legally voting him out to the next election the next time, they decided to get rid of the government and throw them out and bring in somebody that the United States handpicked that we liked. Now, obviously, that's not going to go over well. So then, of course, once the Civil War started a few months later in 2014, the Ukraine military was trying to put down the rebellion in the east, in the Luhansk and the Donetsk provinces. All of a sudden, little green men start coming in from Russia to help them out. And then Putin himself took the opportunity to seize and annex Crimea. And it's important to understand that in Crimea, that's the whole host, and there had been for decades, of the Russia's Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, down in the bottom of the peninsula there, down in Ukraine. So if Ukraine joins NATO, there would have been an obvious problem with Russian Black Sea Fleet where there was a NATO country literally outside the gates. Putin annexed, when he saw that there was a risk that the whole country could fall, he didn't waste any time and he annexed Crimea. In the speech where he told, his national televised speech where he explained why he did, he was very clear on one of the key reasons why.
I have to remind you that already we have calls from Ukraine to join NATO. What does it mean? What does that mean for Russia and Crimea? That in Sevastopol, the city of Russian glory, there would be NATO warships, and this could have happened in reality. But for the choice of the Crimean people, and we thank them for that.
And of course, as we know, there was the Minsk Accords that came out in 2015, where again, Putin, along with the West, Germany, France, and Ukraine, had met, and they formed these Minsk Accords, which resulted in, or would have resulted in, the neutrality of Ukraine, which would have met the threshold for Russia. They said they were okay with that. There was some other terms of agreements, but that was one of the key ones that the Russians wanted because of the security on their border. They're very plain about that. But then we have actually further in 2022, Stoltenberg, after the war had started and the war continued on a little bit further, Stoltenberg said, hey, we know that Russia would not have invaded if we had been willing to say a neutrality status for the Ukraine side. If we had went down that path, whether it's Minsk or any other version, there wouldn't have been a war, because Putin apparently very clearly told him that if Ukraine is going to move into NATO, then we're going to attack. Apparently he told him that privately. Stoltenberg admitted that in 2023 in a derisive sort of way.
President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign, to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
And Gary, I may be throwing you a curveball here, but there is another clip that I'd like to play if we have it. It's for Putin right on the eve of war, where he was asked by a reporter from Sky News, what is your red lines here, and you know, will you continue to attack if these conditions aren't made, if there's no neutrality? And he made very clear on there where his position was. And you see he was getting pretty aggravated. I believe this was right before the war started. And he said very plainly, look, the point is, if NATO comes in here, and he laid the path out for it, he said, your weapons are going to be right up on top of us. He goes, what country would allow that to happen? No country that I'm aware of is going to do that. Gary, were we able to find that one? No. Okay. We don't have that one handy. But he emphatically told this reporter, that's where we're going to go. That's what we're going to do. That's a red line for us. And again, we blew past it. And then you see that apparently privately, he also told Stoltenberg, if you're going to continue to stay with that course, then there's going to be a war. And we ignored it. We just said, yeah, don't care. That's not what we want. So we don't care what the reality is. We don't care what we would do if in the same situation, if this was like Mexico or Canada and China was, for example, going to say they're going to make some kind of a deal and bring them into a Chinese alliance. It's just a defensive alliance. They would say, we would never permit that. We would go crazy if there was any thought of any military being allied against us with either Mexico or Canada on our borders. Of course we would do that, but somehow we think it's going to be different for another one, and they should just accept our words that it's a defensive alliance, so it's not threatening you, even though we would have troops right there on your border. So that's what we ended up having. Then we ended up having a war here. But look, around this same time, shortly after the war started, as we've discussed before, in Istanbul, there was a meeting between Ukraine and Russia, which said, hey, let's have a negotiated settlement and trying to find a way to get this over, because it's not going to end well for Ukraine. The two sides did meet. Erdogan was the host of it. He was trying to find them to make a negotiated settlement. And as Putin subsequently said in his Tucker interview a few weeks back, that was the formation of a deal, and they were ready to make a deal then. Well, the Wall Street Journal piece that we mentioned at the top of the show came out earlier today, and they revealed that there was, very punishing terms for this, and it did. It said that not just neutrality anymore. Now then, the size of their military has to be limited. They can't have any Western weapons in their country, and they can't have any bilateral deals either. So it was really going to make them a weaker state. Now, in light of all the things that have happened here, that would have been a whole lot better than what they ended up with, which was continued war and now hundreds of thousands killed and wounded. Many, many cities lost. It wouldn't have been lost before at that point. So that was a bad deal. Or that would have been as bad of a deal it would have been better than the war, than what they actually have here now. But then we actually find out that in 2021, before the war, so this was not made very much public until later. Brookings Institute actually published something on this recently, which said, hey, there was a draft agreement in 2021 that Putin put up, and there was some talk about it publicly, that he had given these terms to the West. Now, in comparison to the 2022 version they offered, that one was golden, because it didn't say anything about whether Ukraine could have any alliances or not. It said that they couldn't be joining NATO, that NATO couldn't expand any further to the east. That was one of their key things. The other harsh point that the U.S. wasn't going to agree to was it said that all the Western military NATO troops, the NATO troops specifically, and I think by that they meant the United States, could not go into any of the Western, any of the European countries that had joined NATO after 2014, I think, or 2007. No, sorry, 1997. That was the story there. And no one in the West was going to agree to that, because there were already NATO bases in there. But again, this is an entry level. That's what they proposed. That was their first draft. That's what the Russians said. Here's what we want to start from. So you negotiate back and forth. It is crucial to understand that not just did Putin tell Stoltenberg, we won't attack if you'll just declare neutrality. He offered this whole treaty, and it was an actual treaty with the West and the United States in particular, that would have prevented war, that would have left Ukraine in control of everything. They would, all of their country, they would still, even the Donbass, they would nominally control that. And it would have left Crimea, would have had to be negotiated separately. I think there was like a 15-year period or something like that, but at least it was on the table. But none of that stuff was acceptable, because we said, no one's going to tell us what we're going to do. We're going to do everything that we want to, and you're going to like it, or then if you go to war, then we'll defeat you. That seems to be what we said. And just think about that from today. From now in, March 1st, 2024, looking back at it from this pace, if we could have had peace in Europe in 2021, there would never have been a Ukraine war. There would be no issues of nuclear weapons being used now. That wouldn't even be in the conversation. And Europe would still be having all the oil and gas at the lower prices from Russia that they had before that. All of those things would be going on now, and there would be no war. America wouldn't have already given $113 billion of its money away. No one would be begging them for another $60 billion right now. Europe wouldn't have given somewhere around 75 or 100 billion that they've given altogether. Do you understand? All that money would still be in your pocket. You could have used it for anything else. But because we are not willing to deal with reality as it is, now we're in the situation we're at right now. Ukraine is in war. They're losing its war, and there's no path for them to reverse that, short of negotiations to cut it down. I've been saying this since the war started. The longer Ukraine waits to enter into negotiations, the worse deal they're going to get. The more territory Russia is going to take, the more Ukrainian people are going to die. And that is absolutely played out exactly as I warned that it would, and continues to this day to play out. Now, you might think, you would certainly hope, that enough people would finally be going, okay, we finally are belatedly seeing that our policies have been disastrous and they're not being successful. So we're finally going to start changing course and doing something that makes some sense. I'm kidding. Of course, we're not doing that. No, we're going to double down. And in fact, we had this, let's see, Nancy Pelosi was interviewed last night. I think it was on CNN, showing that she's not changed any at all from the House.
They're fighting for their democracy and fighting for our democracy. We need to send the resources to the Ukraine. And I want the people to know that Russia has been very evil, whether it's kidnapping children, raping women, killing families, and all the rest. But also, their army is bigger now than it was when it went into Ukraine. They are building, using money from people who are escaping sanctions and the rest. And getting help from Iran and from China and other places to build their technology. So we'll win in Ukraine. We must. We have to send the money. We must.
It's hard for me to even listen to that whole thing and see how she just totally undercuts her own position. We will win in Ukraine. No, you're not going to win. There's no path to win. And you just laid out the case for it, because Russia is now bigger than it was when the war started. Let that sink in for a second. Before the war started, when we had a chance to make a negotiated settlement that would have ended the war and stopped Russia where it was, they're now more capable than they were then. So if you thought they were a threat then we have made them into a bigger threat. Secondly, she talked about these alliances. Russia never worked openly with with Iran or North Korea before. Now then they're getting hundreds of missiles, millions of rounds of ammunition, of artillery shells on top of what they're producing. So you see, every way you want to look at it, they are getting stronger and more powerful with the passing of each week. And all of this because we won't understand it. And then with no substance at all, she says, we're going to win. We must. So let's give them this money. I can tell you, she has no idea what that money is going to be spent for. She doesn't know anything about how that would have any impact tactically on the ground. She probably knows the only thing that we've been talking about here a lot, that it's going to be American jobs and it's a win-win, like nonsense that the Secretary of State has said recently. But there's no military path, no matter what you do with those dollars, and yet she's just not making that connection. Now, you might want to say, well, she's part of the president's party, so of course she's going to say that. Well, let's look on the other side of the aisle. So a couple of days ago, Senator J.D. Vance said that he's not for providing any money to the Ukraine side because it's not going to make any difference on the battlefield, he says. He has the same view, apparently, that we do on this channel. Well, on CNN last night, Mitt Romney, former Republican presidential nominee back in 2012, was asked about that. And she specifically asked, the anchor did, what about what J.D. Vance says? What is your view?
That is an interesting point. It just happens to be as accurate as it is irrelevant. All right. It may not change their stance on the battlefield. What it does do is communicate to the entire world that we honor our commitments and we stand with our friends, and we will help freedom fighters around the world who are our friends and allies. And that's a message which is important to the people in Taiwan, to the people in Japan, to the people in India, to the people in Europe. I mean, all these people are watching to see, can you count on America? Or is America so isolationist, it doesn't care what happens to the rest of us? If that's the case, by the way, if we cede leadership, if we're no longer the leader of the free world, if we're no longer the arsenal of democracy, then the world is going to look for different leaders.
That is so bizarre. And just think about the illogic of again, just like with Pelosi, his argument is contradictory within its own self. Because on the one hand, he says, sure, JD's right, it's not going to make any difference on the ground. But then he's going to say, let's give them the money anyway. Let's just look at that first part by itself. What sense does it make to say, okay, this country is at war, it's fighting a stronger power, and it wants me to send $60 billion of your dollars over to them, except it's not going to make any difference on the ground. But the message somehow that shows that if we don't, take care of our people, if we don't turn isolationist, then somehow it's going to be bad for people. Others, when all these different countries you mentioned, will look and they'll wonder, are you tracking the implications of what you said for the human beings on the ground in Ukraine, for the people? They are going to die and continue to die in large numbers for no value whatsoever. It won't change the outcome. But by giving them the money and artillery shells to at least keep them on life support, you keep the nation on life support. You don't actually keep the nation on life support. You keep the war on life support. The people are going to die in larger numbers because the war is kept on life support. And you talk about a message that sends. What message do you think all people around the world see when they think America is sending money to a war that can't succeed, that is killing people, that's not accomplishing any of its objectives, and the Ukraine side is going to lose anyway? Do you think these things through? What is the message then if we give the money knowing that it wasn't going to work, it doesn't, and the Russians win? Now how stupid do we look that we knew it wasn't going to work, and yet we did it anyway, instead of doing the one thing that had a shot, and that's insisting on a negotiated settlement? Because we can't. All we have to do is tell the Ukrainian people, their leader, we're going to give you some more money, but it's only for defensive purposes, and you have got to bring this to an end, or you are on your own. If you choose not to do what we're asking, then that's your prerogative, but you'll do it on your own because you won't get anything else from us, and then we'll see if that changes his idea there. But we know that that's not likely to, because when he's meeting with members of the House of Representatives, Zelensky a couple of days ago said this on television.
I had a meeting with him, with Speaker Johnson, and he also, if we can trust each other, this is again the question of how to trust partners or not. That's it, what I have to say. So when we spoke each other, he said that he will do everything to support Ukraine, and he is on our side.
You can see the way Zelensky's talking there, because he's talking to Mike Johnson, who is emphatic on every television interview he's done in recent weeks of saying he's not going to improve anything for Ukraine until he gets money and changes for the border. And since we know that that's likely coming from President Trump, who apparently doesn't want any kind of a deal done for anything, because he wants to leave that, that border an open issue so it remains an issue on the voters that he will then, use to his advantage when it comes time for the election. But even if that wasn't part of the deal, there are so many Republicans for whom the border is a genuine issue, and it certainly is for us. We talk about that all the time. We need to secure that border. And if the White House is not willing to come up with that and prioritize America's national security on our own border before giving money somewhere else, that money's not coming. And you could see Zelensky's face. He tried to put the right face on it, but he knows that talking to Mike Johnson, that he's not going to do that. That there's no expectation anytime coming soon that there's going to be any money for that. So if they get $60 billion, it's not going to matter. If they don't get any money, it's going to be even worse. But again, you have the West not wanting to learn any lessons from this. And instead of recognizing, okay, the American Congress might give some more money, maybe they won't, but there's no expectation they're going to give any more. Europe has already given all they're going to for the next 4 years. You may have heard that they finally agreed on a $50 billion package. What you may not have heard was that spread out over 4 years. So it's a very small number and just enough to basically keep their state administratively from it. It's not even for military operations. Nobody's talking about more tanks, planes, and other kinds of ammunitions beyond the contracts that are already done for artillery shells, which will be ramping up at a slow pace the rest of the year and the next year, should the war continue on. But then you had President Macron of France a couple of days back, a week or so ago, muse about the possibility of maybe we would send some troops into Ukraine. If they can't win on the ground with the equipment, maybe some NATO countries would want to send troops over there, which of course is just, again, because of all these clips I've shown you from Putin running up. That's his red line. Now, as I told you earlier in this segment, when he has said that Ukraine and Georgia in NATO were red lines, he acted militarily in both of those cases and made good on his threats. So he did act to keep them from coming into NATO. And then when you had Stoltenberg again a few days ago on the 2-year anniversary specifically, again declare, nope, Ukraine is still coming into NATO. We're still going to do that. All you do is play into the red line fears of Vladimir Putin and make him think he's going to have to do something else. In one of our recent episodes, we showed you some footage of a NATO exercise that's going on, 90,000 troops right on his border there. So that's concerning him too. And then he sees Macron say, we may send troops into Ukraine. What do we think he's going to do about that, folks? You've seen him now for 15 years, almost 17 now, say that his security on his border is a red line. Well, he did have a response to this, and he went on national television, I believe it was just yesterday, and reiterate what his red line is if you put troops into Ukraine and fight against his troops.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself, weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
Now, you may have seen us play a clip not long ago that Putin made a few days, or like 2 weeks, I think exactly, before the war started, where he also made these comments about the potential for nuclear war and how he didn't want that. He does not want it because there is no prospect for winning. Everyone would lose. Civilization would lose. His country would lose. But he is not going to allow his country to be militarily defeated conventionally and not use those weapons. Why, in God's name, do we even want to pretend that that's not the case? And we want to push right up to that to see if this time, does he actually mean it, even though he did mean it all these other times? Get this. Don't miss this, folks. He said that Ukraine and Georgia were red lines. He would not allow Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. He took limited military action in Georgia, and he's taken full-on military action in Ukraine. Do you think he means it when he says he will use nuclear weapons if NATO moves into and actually starts engaging with Russia? Or if somehow, some mysterious way that, NATO does push this massive amount of stuff, which right now isn't even on the table, and suddenly they do start getting pushed out. Like Nancy Pelosi says, we have to win and Russia has to lose. But Russia losing means nuclear war. So if your aspiration was to start to become realized, then you lose instantly because it's nuclear war. Every way you want to look at it, the rational thing to do is to seek peace. But you see, all of our people are fighting against peace. How can this be? How can it be that all the leaders of our countries are fighting tooth and nail against peace? Where are the people that are fighting for peace, that are saying war is absurd? It can't accomplish anything positive. The only time war makes any sense is if your country has been attacked, like Pearl Harbor. Then that made some sense there because our nation was physically attacked, a massive attack against our military, and our whole country was put at risk. In that case, then you have to respond to that. And that's why you have a strong military, for which I'm an advocate. I am definitely not a peacenik. I'm not an anti-war person. I'm an anti-stupid war person. And this is a stupid war because all it does is get our friends in Ukraine killed by the day. It has no prospect to achieve a victory, and it doesn't make the world any safer afterwards. And to continue to prosecute it puts us at the risk of nuclear escalation. Now, if that's not the definition of stupid, I don't know what it is. I could use some other words, but I'm not going to because this is a family-friendly show. But you get the point. It is time to change course. And you see all of our leaders from both parties and our allies as well, their leadership is moving us in absurd directions that it's just unfathomable to me how irrational and illogical what we're saying and what we're doing are. We even acknowledge that this money is not going to change the outcome on the ground, and they want to do it anyway. They see Putin saying one thing, his red lines meaning that, taking action on it, and then they still want to press up on the nuclear threshold. It's irrational, and it's time for a change. It's time for our leaders to finally do something that makes sense and to fight for peace, not against it. That's what we need to do. We thank you for joining us today. We're going to continue to bring you all the kinds of information on here. We're not going to let this stuff go by. We're not going to let our leaders make these absurd claims and it not be challenged. We're going to hold their feet to the fire, and hopefully when it comes to the ballot box, they'll be held accountable. But you need to know the truth, and you can count on us giving you the truth no matter what anybody else wants to say. Be sure and join us at 11 a.m. tomorrow because we're going to have an exclusive here about the Ukraine F-16 issue and how, a lot of people want to say that that's the next thing that'll be the game changer. That'll turn things around here. But folks, spoiler alert, It ain't gonna, but you're going to want to see what we have here for you tomorrow, because that's the next level of truth that we're going to provide. Thanks. Be sure and like and subscribe, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.